October 14th, 1942. The jungle canopy on Guadalcanal hung low and heavy, pregnant with moisture that never fully released. Private First Class Harold Mitchell crouched behind a fallen mahogany trunk, its bark slick with moss and rot, while somewhere in the green darkness above, a Japanese sniper's bullet clipped a palm frond 3 feet from his head. The sound came after, a flat crack that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere. Mitchell's hands, calloused from Kansas wheat fields and steady from 1,000 mornings spent hunting white-tailed deer in the Flint Hills, did not shake as they gripped the worn walnut stock of his rifle. It was not a standard issue M1 Garand. It was not a Springfield 1903. It was a Remington Model 721, a bolt-action hunting rifle he had purchased through the pages of a sporting goods catalog for $47.50, shipped to his family farm in Marion County 14 months before Pearl Harbor. The Marines in his platoon had laughed when he'd carried it off the Higgins boat. They stopped laughing on the 3rd day. The Solomon Islands campaign had become a grinding war of attrition, a contest measured not in miles gained, but in yards clawed from jungle and coral. Guadalcanal was where American optimism first met Japanese fanaticism on equal terms, where the doctrines of both empires collided in fetid swamps and ridgelines that appeared on no decent map. Henderson Field, that narrow strip of coral and crushed limestone, had become the most valuable acre of earth in the Pacific, a fixed point around which navies circled and died, around which young men from Iowa and Osaka bled into soil that belonged to neither. The Japanese had held it first, their engineers carving an airstrip from jungle with Korean labor and imperial ambition. Then the Marines had taken it, and now both sides fed men into the meat grinder to keep it or reclaim it, each convinced that this insignificant island would determine the trajectory of the war. It would, but not for the reasons either side imagined. Harold Mitchell had not wanted to be a Marine. He had wanted to be a farmer, like his father and his father's father, men who understood the language of seasons and soil, who measured success in bushels per acre and the straightness of a furrow. But the farm had failed in 1939, crushed between drought and debt, and Mitchell had taken work at a meatpacking plant in Topeka, saving money with the vague intention of buying back the land someday. He was 23 years old when the radio announced that Japanese aircraft had bombed the Pacific Fleet at anchor. He enlisted on December 9th, not from patriotism, though he felt that too, but from the practical understanding that the world was changing in ways that would not wait for his permission. The recruiter in Wichita had asked if he could shoot. Mitchell had nodded. The recruiter did not ask what he could shoot with, and Mitchell did not volunteer that his primary rifle was a civilian bolt-action ordered from the back pages of Field and Stream magazine. The Marine Corps trained him at Camp Pendleton, taught him to field strip an M1 Garand in 30 seconds, to dig a foxhole in coral, to recognize the silhouette of a zero against clouds. They did not teach him patience, because that could not be taught. Patience was what you learned waiting for a 10-point buck to step into a clearing at dawn, what you learned watching a hawk circle thermals above Kansas grassland. Patience was the only skill Mitchell brought to the Pacific that the Corps had not issued him, and it would prove more valuable than any manual of arms. When his unit shipped out in August 1942, Mitchell carried the Remington in a canvas case alongside his regulation rifle. His sergeant saw it and said nothing. Some men carried Bibles. Some carried photographs. Mitchell carried insurance. The Japanese soldiers who defended Guadalcanal expected to meet an enemy softened by luxury, weakened by democracy, corrupted by the individualism that their own training had taught them to despise. The Imperial Japanese Army doctrine emphasized spirit over firepower, will over material, the collective soul of the Yamato race over the mechanical advantages of industrial production. They had been told that Americans could not endure hardship, that they would break when faced with soldiers willing to die for the emperor. This was not propaganda, this was doctrine, encoded in field manuals and training regimens, reinforced by every officer from Tokyo to Rabaul. The concept was called Seishin Kyoiku, spiritual education, and it permeated every level of Japanese military thought. A soldier's spirit, properly cultivated through discipline and devotion, could overcome any material disadvantage. A bayonet charge executed with sufficient fighting spirit could break a machine gun position. A soldier who had accepted death had already transcended the limitations of flesh and steel. This was what they believed. This was what they had been taught in barracks from Hokkaido to Kyushu, drilled into them until it became not merely doctrine but identity. And so when the Marines landed on Guadalcanal, the Japanese prepared to teach them the price of challenging the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. They prepared to demonstrate that spiritual strength could overcome material wealth, that a soldier who accepted death had already won. They had seen the Americans in the Philippines, had watched them surrender at Bataan and Corregidor, had concluded that these were men who valued comfort more than honor, who would choose captivity over death. They had been trained to view surrender as the ultimate shame, a fate worse than any battlefield death, and they projected this belief onto their enemies. The Americans, they reasoned, with their soft hands and their full bellies, would crumble when faced with soldiers who had no fear of dying. It was a reasonable assumption based on everything their culture had taught them. It was also catastrophically wrong. What they encountered instead bewildered them. The Americans who clawed their way inland from the beaches were not soft. They were farm boys and factory workers, men who understood machinery and improvisation, who treated warfare as a problem to be solved rather than a ritual to be performed. They did not charge into machine gun fire when they could call in naval artillery. They did not consider surrender dishonorable when tactical retreat preserved the unit. They ate food from tin cans that contained more calories than a Japanese soldier received in 3 days. They wore boots that did not rot in the jungle. They received mail. The spiritual strength of Bushido met the material abundance of American logistics, and the jungle became a laboratory for testing which philosophy would prevail. It was not a fair test. Logistics always wins. But there were places where logistics could not reach, positions where abundance could not be delivered by Higgins' boat or parachute. In the jungle canopy, among the mahogany and ironwood trees, Japanese snipers had constructed platforms invisible from the ground, lashed to trunks with vines and patience. They tied themselves to branches so they would not fall when shot. They carried rice for a week and ammunition for a month. They understood that their role was not to win battles, but to inflict a psychological cost, to make every American advance a transaction paid in blood. And they were effective. In the first 2 weeks after the landing, Marine casualties from sniper fire exceeded those from banzai charges. Men began to move differently, hunched and hesitant, eyes scanning trees instead of sightlines. The jungle had eyes, and they were patient. The Japanese sniper was not simply a marksman. He was a guerrilla fighter trained in the art of concealment, a ghost who could remain motionless for hours in positions that would leave Western soldiers cramping and compromised. They understood camouflage not as a uniform, but as a philosophy. They used natural materials, leaves, moss, bark, to break up their silhouettes. They positioned themselves not where they had the best shot, but where they were least likely to be seen. They accepted that they might get only one opportunity, and they made that opportunity count. Some tied themselves to trees at heights of 40 or 50 feet, knowing that American soldiers rarely looked up, that the human eye naturally scanned at horizontal angles. Some wore woven grass suits that made them indistinguishable from the vegetation around them. Some waited in trees for days, watching marine positions, learning patterns, identifying targets of value, officers, radio men, anyone whose death would create maximum disruption. Mitchell's platoon lost its first man to a sniper on August 23rd. Private Kowalski, a Polish kid from Milwaukee who talked constantly about his mother's pierogi, stepped into a clearing to refill his canteen from a stream. The bullet entered behind his left ear and exited through his right cheekbone, and Kowalski was dead before his body registered the impact. No one saw a muzzle flash. No one heard the shot until after. The sniper did not fire again. That night, the platoon sergeant, a career Marine named Gutierrez who had fought in Nicaragua, gathered the men and asked if anyone had hunting experience. 3 hands went up. Mitchell's was one of them. Gutierrez looked at the Remington in its canvas case and asked if Mitchell knew how to use it. Mitchell said he did. Gutierrez assigned him to counter-sniper duty, effective immediately. The men who had laughed at the mail-order rifle did not laugh anymore. Kowalski's blood was still dark on the coral. The morning after Kowalski died, Mitchell walked the perimeter alone, studying the terrain. The jungle was different from Kansas grassland in every measurable way: the density of vegetation, the humidity that made every breath feel like drowning, the sounds that never stopped, insects and birds and things that rustled in undergrowth. But the principles were the same. A predator needed concealment, a clear line of sight, and an escape route. Mitchell looked for places that offered all 3. He found 7 potential sniper positions within 300 yards of where Kowalski had fallen. 3 were in trees. 2 were in dense thickets that offered ground-level concealment. 2 were in elevated positions on the ridge above the stream. He marked them mentally, creating a map in his mind of where death might come from. This was not something the Marine Corps had taught him. This was something he had learned hunting coyotes that preyed on his father's chickens, predators that were intelligent enough to learn patterns and avoid traps. You did not hunt coyotes by chasing them. You hunted them by thinking like they thought, by anticipating where they would go and being there first. The Remington Model 721 was never intended for military service. It was a sporting rifle, designed for American hunters who wanted accuracy at reasonable cost, who needed a gun that could drop a deer at 200 yards and still be light enough to carry through rough country. Mitchell had purchased it in 1941 because the old Winchester his father owned had finally cracked its stock beyond repair, and the Remington was what he could afford. It chambered .30-06 Springfield, the same cartridge as the military 1903, and it was capable of sub-MOA accuracy when properly handled, 1-inch groups at 100 yards if the shooter did his part. The bolt was smooth, the trigger clean, the barrel free-floated in a design that minimized contact with the stock. Mitchell had mounted a Weaver 330 scope on it, a 4-power optic that cost almost as much as the rifle itself, saving for 3 months to purchase glass that would not fog in morning dew. He had zeroed it on the farm, firing from prone position at targets pinned to hay bales, adjusting windage and elevation until the rifle shot where he looked. That was before the war. Now the scope was scratched, the stock was swollen from humidity, and the rifle had killed men instead of deer. The scope made all the difference. The Marine Corps in 1942 did not issue scoped rifles as standard equipment. There were some Springfield 1903s equipped with unertl scopes, precision instruments used by competitive shooters before the war, but these were rare and reserved for designated marksmen. Most Marines fought with iron sights, adequate for targets within 100 yards, but limited beyond that range. Mitchell's Weaver scope, purchased from a Sears catalog and mounted in his father's barn, gave him an advantage that military logistics had not provided. He could identify targets at distances where they appeared as shadows to the naked eye. He could see details, a hand gripping a rifle, a face behind vegetation, that revealed position and intent. The Japanese snipers he hunted had good eyes and excellent concealment, but they did not expect to be seen before they fired. The scope changed the equation. It turned Mitchell from prey into predator. On his first counter-sniper patrol, Mitchell moved alone. This was not bravery, it was necessity. A sniper hunting another sniper could not afford the noise of a squad, could not risk the movement of companions who did not understand that stillness was a weapon. He carried the Remington, 60 rounds of ammunition, a canteen, and a machete. He carried no rations, because the patrols lasted only until he found his target or nightfall forced him back. He moved in the early morning, when light was flat and shadows had not yet formed, when Japanese snipers were either settling into position or too exhausted from a night of vigilance to maintain perfect discipline. He looked for things that did not belong, the geometric lines of a constructed platform, the unnatural color of fabric in a tree, the absence of birds in a section of canopy. Nature had rhythms, and humans disrupted them. Mitchell had learned this hunting deer. Deer vanished when predators arrived. Birds did the same. He found his first Japanese sniper on August 26, 60 hours after Kowalski died. The man was 30 feet up a banyan tree, concealed behind a screen of epiphytes and vines, tied to the trunk with hemp rope. He wore a camouflaged smock and a cloth wrapped around his Arisaka rifle to prevent glare. He was good, but he had made one mistake. He had positioned himself to watch the trail below, which meant his back was partially exposed to anyone approaching from the ridge above. Mitchell saw him from 200 yards, a shadow that was slightly too regular, a shape that suggested human shoulders. He moved closer, using the terrain, keeping the trunk of the banyan between himself and the sniper's line of sight. At 100 yards, he went prone. At 80 yards, he settled the crosshairs on the center of the shadow and waited. A sniper's greatest vulnerability is his focus. The Japanese soldier was watching the trail, patient and still, waiting for a Marine to walk into his kill zone. He never saw Mitchell. The Remington fired once. The 180-grain bullet covered 80 yards in a fraction of a second, passed through the vegetation screen, and struck the sniper in the upper spine. He slumped against the ropes that held him, dead before his nervous system could process the message. Mitchell cycled the bolt, waited 5 minutes to see if anyone else responded, then moved back toward the perimeter. He did not climb the tree to confirm the kill. Confirmation would come when that particular stretch of trail stopped costing lives. The Japanese command on Guadalcanal began to notice a pattern. Snipers who took position in certain sectors did not report back. Radio silence from observation posts was not unusual. Men died, equipment failed, but the losses were concentrated in areas where the American lines were thinnest, where a good counter-sniper could operate without friendly fire concerns. They adapted. Snipers began working in pairs, one watching the primary target, the other watching for threats. They changed positions more frequently. They accepted shorter engagement windows to minimize exposure. These were good tactics. They slowed Mitchell down. They did not stop him. On September 3rd, Mitchell killed 2 Japanese snipers in a single engagement. They had positioned themselves in adjacent trees, overlooking a supply route the Marines used to move ammunition forward. The first sniper revealed himself by firing at a corporal carrying mortar rounds. The bullet missed, clipping a branch, but Mitchell marked the muzzle blast. The second sniper was 30 yards away, scanning in Mitchell's direction, searching for the counter-sniper he suspected was there. Mitchell had a choice: shoot the one he had located and lose the element of surprise, or wait and risk losing both. He shot the first sniper through the head at 140 yards. The second sniper swung toward the sound, trying to locate the source, and Mitchell worked the bolt and fired again before the man could acquire him. The second shot took the sniper in the chest. Both men fell. Neither made a sound. Mitchell moved immediately, knowing that anyone close enough to hear the shots would be converging on his position. He was a quarter-mile away before the Japanese response team reached the bodies. The Remington became known in the platoon. Men who had mocked the mail-order rifle began to ask Mitchell about it, questions framed casually, as if curiosity rather than respect motivated them. How far could it shoot? How many rounds did he carry? Could it really outperform the Springfield? Mitchell answered briefly. Yes, it could shoot far enough. Yes, it was accurate. No, it was not better than the Springfield for every job. The Springfield had been designed for military use, for bayonet charges and trench warfare, for conditions where reliability mattered more than precision. But for the specific task of killing a man at distance, from concealment, with one shot, the Remington was perfect. It was a tool built for a purpose, and Mitchell used it the way he had used every tool on the farm, with respect, maintenance, and the understanding that failure meant consequences. He cleaned the rifle every night, even when exhausted, running patches through the bore until they came out white, wiping moisture from every metal surface, checking the scope mounts for looseness. The rifle had cost him $47.50. It had saved his life a dozen times, and the lives of men he would never meet. By mid-September, Mitchell's official tally stood at 6 confirmed kills. The actual number was higher, but confirmation required either a recovered body or a witness, and Mitchell often operated alone in areas where body recovery was impossible. The Marine Corps did not yet have a formal sniper program. That would come later, lessons learned in blood on islands like Guadalcanal, but the officers recognized utility when they saw it. Mitchell received informal permission to continue his counter-sniper work, exempted from standard patrols and guard rotations. He became a specialist in a war that did not yet have a name for his specialty. The Japanese knew him only as a ghost that killed snipers, a presence that made certain areas of jungle untenable for observation. They increased patrols. They offered bounties. They assigned their best marksmen to hunt him. Mitchell killed them too. What the Japanese soldiers experienced on Guadalcanal was not what they had been promised. They had been told that sacrifice would bring victory, that spiritual strength would overcome material disadvantage. Instead, they starved. The supply convoys that Tokyo promised failed to arrive, sunk by American submarines, or turned back by naval engagements that their officers described as tactical withdrawals. The Japanese Navy attempted resupply runs under cover of darkness, operations the Americans called the Tokyo Express and the Japanese called rat runs, fast destroyer runs that delivered minimal supplies at maximum risk. Sometimes the destroyers got through. Often they did not. The soldiers waiting in the jungle counted the days between deliveries, rationed rice that was already insufficient, watched their portions shrink from inadequate to starvation. They ate roots and leaves. They boiled tree bark into a paste that provided fiber but no nutrition. They watched comrades die from malaria and dysentery, from infected wounds that would have been trivial with access to medicine. They developed deficiency diseases, beriberi from lack of thiamine, scurvy from lack of vitamin C, conditions that turned strong men into invalids who could barely walk. and they saw American planes fly overhead, formations so large they darkened the sky, dropping supplies to Marine positions with casual abundance. They watched parachutes blossom above Henderson Field, carrying crates of ammunition, medical supplies, food. They heard American artillery, endless barrages that spoke of ammunition stockpiles beyond imagination. They began to understand that the war they were fighting was not the war they had been taught to expect. The Americans were not weak. They were not soft. They were simply operating from an industrial base so vast that it turned war into arithmetic. The Japanese could trade one life for one American life and still lose, because America had more lives to spend and more resources to spend them with. This was not a truth that could be spoken, not a conclusion that could be reported to superiors. But it was understood in the silence of foxholes and the weight of empty supply crates. Mitchell killed his 7th confirmed sniper on September 19th, an engagement that lasted 4 hours. The Japanese soldier had concealed himself in the hollowed trunk of a fallen tree, positioned to cover a river crossing the Marines needed to use. He was disciplined, firing only when presented with clear targets, never revealing his position through unnecessary shots. Mitchell spent the morning searching, moving in slow circles, reading the jungle for signs. He found him by noticing that birds avoided a particular section of the riverbank, a dead zone in the soundscape where no wildlife ventured. The sniper was inside the log, invisible except for the narrow firing port he had carved. Mitchell could not get a clean shot. He waited. Hours passed. The sun moved. The sniper shifted slightly, adjusting his position, and for 3 seconds his shoulder was exposed. Mitchell fired. The bullet punched through the rotted wood and into the man behind it. The sniper did not move again. The waiting was harder than the shooting. Mitchell spent hours in positions that cramped his legs and numbed his arms, motionless while insects crawled across his skin and the sun tracked overhead. He learned to breathe shallowly, to ignore thirst, to let his mind drift into a state of relaxed awareness where time became irrelevant. This was not dissimilar to deer hunting, where a morning in a blind could pass without seeing game, where success depended on the willingness to remain still longer than the prey remained cautious. But deer did not shoot back. Deer did not hunt the hunter. The Japanese snipers he stalked were professionals who understood concealment as well as he did, who had trained for this work, who were willing to die in position rather than reveal themselves prematurely. Mitchell respected them the way he respected any dangerous predator. Respect did not mean mercy. It meant acknowledging that the enemy was competent and adjusting tactics accordingly. The 8th and 9th kills came in early October, during the Japanese offensive that the Marines would later call the Battle for Henderson Field. The Japanese committed thousands of troops to recapturing the airstrip, waves of infantry supported by artillery and armor, an all-or-nothing push that nearly succeeded. General Vandegrift's Marines held by margins measured in yards, by the willingness of men to stay in positions that should have been overrun, by the accuracy of artillery observers who called fire missions on targets danger close to their own positions. The Japanese attacked at night, using darkness to negate American firepower advantages, accepting casualties that no Western army would consider sustainable. They believed that one more push would break the American lines, that one more sacrifice would achieve what all previous sacrifices had failed to accomplish. They were wrong, but their wrongness cost blood. In the chaos, snipers became less relevant, but Mitchell continued his work because snipers did not stop being deadly just because the battle had grown larger. He killed one Japanese marksman who had positioned himself to target American machine gun crews, shooting him through a gap in a coral outcropping at 180 yards. The sniper had been effective, had killed 2 gunners and wounded a third before Mitchell located him. The 9th kill was a sniper who had set up in the wreckage of a destroyed Zero, using the fuselage for cover and the confusion of battle to mask his shots. Mitchell found him by watching for muzzle flash during a Japanese artillery barrage, when the sniper thought the noise would cover his firing. Both times, the Remington's trigger broke cleanly, the recoil punched his shoulder, and a man died before hearing the shot that killed him. The 10th kill was personal, though Mitchell never spoke of it that way. On October 12th, his platoon sergeant, Gutierrez, the Nicaragua veteran who had first assigned Mitchell to counter-sniper duty, was shot while coordinating a supply drop. The bullet entered his thigh, severing the femoral artery, and Gutierrez bled out in 90 seconds despite the corpsman's efforts. He died with his hand clamped over the wound, applying pressure that could not stop arterial bleeding, his face showing not pain, but frustration that his body was betraying him. Mitchell had been 50 yards away when it happened. He heard the shot, heard the corpsman yelling for help, arrived in time to see Gutierrez die. The sergeant's last words were practical. He told the lieutenant where the supply coordination papers were stored, gave brief instructions about patrol schedules, then closed his eyes and stopped breathing. The sniper who fired the shot was good enough to hit a moving target at range, disciplined enough to fire once and relocate. Mitchell tracked him for 2 days, reading the jungle for clues, interviewing wounded men about shot angles, triangulating possibilities. He found the sniper on October 14th, the same day this script began, concealed in the canopy above a trail junction. Mitchell's shot took him through the chest at 160 yards. This is the moment the platoon would remember, the kill that transformed Mitchell from a competent marksman into a legend, because the Marines who witnessed it counted the distance and marveled at the precision. They did not know that Mitchell had made harder shots on Kansas deer at greater range. They did not know that the Remington was capable of accuracy far beyond what they considered possible. They only knew that their sergeant had been avenged, and the rifle that had seemed like a joke now seemed like something else entirely. The 11th Japanese sniper died on October 23rd. By then, the Japanese offensive had failed, broken against Marine defenses and American firepower, and the strategic initiative in the Solomons had shifted permanently. The sniper was young, perhaps 19, positioned in a tree overlooking the Lunga River. Mitchell found him in the morning, made the shot in the afternoon, and walked back to the perimeter as the sun set behind the ridgeline. This kill did not feel different from the others. There was no drama, no climax, just a man in a tree who died because Mitchell's bullet arrived before his awareness did. But it was the 11th confirmed kill, and 11 was a number that meant something to the men who counted such things. 11 was enough to be exceptional. 11 was enough to be remembered. The Remington Model 721 had become a symbol, though Mitchell resisted the symbolism. To him, it was still a tool, a $47 rifle that happened to be well-made and properly maintained. But to the Marines who fought alongside him, the rifle represented something more. It represented the idea that America did not need purpose-built weapons to defeat an enemy armed with swords and ritual. It represented the abundance of a nation where a farm boy could mail-order a precision rifle from a catalog and have it shipped to his door, where civilian industry produced goods of such quality that they could be repurposed for war without modification. The Japanese snipers carried Arisaka rifles issued by an empire that controlled every aspect of production, that subordinated individual choice to collective need. Mitchell carried a rifle he had chosen himself, purchased with money he had earned, modified with an optic he had saved for. The Japanese rifle was a tool of the state. The American rifle was an expression of freedom, of the vast industrial and commercial infrastructure that allowed citizens to arm themselves as they saw fit. This was not planned. No doctrine had anticipated it. But it was true, and the truth was written in the bodies of 11 Japanese snipers who had underestimated what American individualism could produce. The contrast extended beyond rifles. The Japanese soldier on Guadalcanal ate a daily ration of rice that provided roughly 1,500 calories, supplemented occasionally with canned fish or pickled vegetables when supply lines functioned. By October, when those supply lines had collapsed, the daily ration had dropped to a handful of rice, sometimes nothing at all. Men fought on empty stomachs, their bodies consuming muscle for fuel, their strength fading day by day. The American Marine ate 3 meals daily, totaling close to 4,000 calories: canned meat, crackers, chocolate, fruit, coffee with sugar. The rations were not gourmet, but they were abundant. A Japanese officer captured late in the campaign told his interrogators that the most demoralizing aspect of fighting Americans was not their firepower but their food. He described watching through binoculars as Marines casually discarded half-eaten rations, throwing away more calories than a Japanese soldier received in a day. He described the psychological impact of facing an enemy who could afford to waste food, who were supplied so lavishly that they treated abundance as routine. This was the arithmetic of industrial warfare, written in calories and ammunition tonnage, in the capacity to project power across 6,000 miles of ocean and sustain it indefinitely. After Guadalcanal, Mitchell was rotated back to Australia for rest and refit. The Remington went with him, and then to Cape Gloucester, and then to Peleliu. The rifle saw more combat than most Marines, carried through campaigns that names like Bloody Nose Ridge and Purple Beach only hinted at. He would survive the war with 17 confirmed kills, though the actual number was certainly higher. He never became famous. The Marine Corps sniper program that emerged from the Pacific War would be built on lessons learned by men like Mitchell, but his name appeared in no manuals, no training films. The doctrine that would eventually produce Marine Scout snipers as a formal military occupational specialty was being written in real time by men who learned through trial and error what worked in jungle warfare. Mitchell contributed to that doctrine without knowing he was doing so, simply by surviving and killing and coming back to do it again. He was simply one of thousands who did their job with the tools they had, who adapted and survived and went home when it was over. The rifle went home too. Mitchell kept it for the rest of his life, stored in a gun safe in the house he built in Kansas after buying back his family's farm with money saved from 4 years of combat pay. He never mounted another scope on it. He never fired it again. It had done its job, and some tools deserved retirement. His children asked about it occasionally, the old rifle with the scratched stock and the worn bluing, and Mitchell would tell them it was a hunting rifle he had owned before the war. This was true. It was not the whole truth, but the whole truth was not something he knew how to explain. How do you tell your daughter that the rifle she sees in the cabinet had killed 11 men? How do you explain that those 11 men were also sons and brothers, that they had probably owned rifles before the war too, that in a different timeline they might have been fellow hunters rather than enemies? Mitchell did not have those conversations. He farmed his land, raised his family, and left the rifle in its case. The Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal carried different lessons home. They had learned that spirit could not stop bullets, that will could not fill empty stomachs, that the Americans they had been taught to despise were neither weak nor corrupted by luxury. They had learned that the abundance they saw, the canned food, the ammunition stockpiles, the casual replacement of equipment, was not a sign of moral decay, but of industrial strength so vast it was incomprehensible. They had been told that Americans valued their lives too much to die for their country. On Guadalcanal, they watched Americans die by the thousands to hold an airstrip that appeared on no one's maps before 1942. They had been told that democracy made men soft. Instead, they found that democracy made men dangerous because it gave them a reason to fight beyond obedience. A conscript fights because he must. A citizen fights because he chooses to. The difference is subtle but decisive. In the decades after the war, historians would analyze Guadalcanal as a turning point, the moment when American strategy shifted from defense to offense, when the Empire of Japan lost the initiative it would never regain. They would study tonnage and ship movements, divisions committed and casualties inflicted. They would debate the decisions of admirals and generals, the wisdom of strategies, and the execution of plans. They would note that the Marines suffered approximately 1,600 killed and 4,000 wounded, while the Japanese lost 24,000 dead and another 1,000 captured. These numbers told a story of attrition, of an empire that could not afford to trade lives at that ratio, that did not have the industrial base to replace losses. This analysis would be correct as far as it went, but it would miss something smaller and more fundamental, something that could not be quantified in after-action reports or measured in miles of territory gained. It would miss Harold Mitchell and his mail-order rifle, and the 11 Japanese snipers who died because a Kansas farm boy understood patience and owned a $47 gun. It would miss the symbolism of that rifle, the way it embodied the distance between two philosophies of war, one that armed citizens and trusted them to improvise, and one that armed soldiers and demanded they obey. One philosophy built rifles in small workshops and shipped them through mail-order catalogs to anyone with money and a mailing address. The other philosophy built rifles in state arsenals and issued them to men who had surrendered their individuality to the collective. Both philosophies went to war in 1942. Only one of them came home. The jungle on Guadalcanal grew back over the foxholes and the trails, over the wreckage of planes and the graves of men whose names appeared on memorials in towns they would never see again. The banyan trees where snipers once perched continued their slow climb toward sunlight, indifferent to the history that had briefly intersected their trunks. The trails that Mitchell walked, hunting men who were hunting him, faded into undergrowth and memory. But the lesson remained, encoded not in monuments or textbooks, but in the quiet understanding of men who had been there, who had seen what worked and what did not, who had learned that wars are won not by the side with the most courage, but by the side with the most resources and the wisdom to use them. The Japanese soldier who climbed into the jungle canopy with a week's worth of rice and a conviction that his spirit would overcome material disadvantage was brave. He was dedicated. He had trained for years, had mastered the skills of concealment and marksmanship, had accepted that he might die in service to the emperor. His courage was real. His skill was genuine. But courage and skill were not enough when facing an enemy who brought both courage and abundance, who combined fighting spirit with industrial capacity, who could afford to waste ammunition on training and food on soldiers who might never fire a shot. The American soldier who carried a commercial hunting rifle purchased from a catalog and used it to kill 11 men was not more courageous. He was simply better equipped, better fed, and backed by an economy that could turn farmland into firepower and democracy into dominance. Harold Mitchell returned to Kansas in 1945, 26 years old, and carrying memories that would never fully translate into words. He married, had children, farmed the land his grandfather had cleared. He did not talk about the war except in fragments, moments recalled not for their drama but for their strangeness. The weight of humidity in the jungle, the way coral dust got into everything, the taste of canned peaches eaten in a foxhole while artillery shook the earth. He did not talk about the 11 Japanese snipers or the Remington that killed them. That rifle, the mail-order gun that his platoon had laughed at and then relied on, sat in his gun safe for 50 years, a relic of a moment when the distance between civilian life and military necessity had collapsed, when a tool built for Kansas deer had been repurposed to kill the snipers of an empire. The rifle did not care. It was steel and wood, shaped by machinists in a factory in Ilion, New York, shipped by rail to Kansas, and then by boat to the Pacific. It performed the task it was designed for. It shot accurately, reliably, when the man behind the trigger did his part. That was enough. That was always enough. The rifle had no ideology, no loyalty, no understanding of the larger war. It was simply a well-made tool in the hands of a competent user, and that combination proved sufficient to change outcomes in a narrow corner of a vast war. This is the paradox of warfare, that individual actions, one man with one rifle killing 11 enemies, can have strategic consequences far beyond their immediate tactical effect. Mitchell's 11 kills did not win the Guadalcanal campaign, but they contributed to the cumulative weight of small victories that made the campaign winnable, to the slow process of attrition that broke Japanese capability and will. The lesson of Harold Mitchell and his Remington Model 721 is not about heroism, though heroism was present. It is not about technology, though technology mattered. It is about the infrastructure of freedom, the way a society organized around individual choice creates an abundance that cannot be matched by systems organized around collective obedience. The rifle was a symptom of that abundance, a product of a nation where mail-order catalogs offered precision firearms to anyone with $47.50, where a farm boy could choose his own tools and trust they would be good enough. The Japanese snipers who died in the canopy over Guadalcanal were not defeated by Mitchell alone. They were defeated by the economy that built his rifle, the logistics that kept him fed, the society that taught him to think for himself. They were defeated by the vast, humming, chaotic engine of American democracy, which produced not just weapons, but citizens who knew how to use them. This was the truth that Guadalcanal proved, written in blood and coral dust, and the bodies of men who believed that spirit could overcome steel. It could not. It never could. And the mail-order rifle, laughed at on the beach in Legendary by October, was the proof. That rifle, purchased from a catalog and carried into jungle warfare, represented every advantage that democracy held over autocracy: the freedom to choose, the capacity to produce, the wisdom to trust citizens with tools and responsibility. These advantages were not dramatic. They did not win battles in moments of heroic glory. They won wars through cumulative effect, through the slow grinding arithmetic of resources and production, through the prosaic reality that well-fed soldiers with good equipment tend to defeat starving soldiers with inadequate supplies. This was the lesson that Harold Mitchell never articulated but always understood. The rifle in his safe was not a trophy. It was a reminder of what abundance could accomplish, of what happened when individual capability met collective need, of what was possible when a nation trusted its citizens enough to let them choose their own tools. $47.50, paid from the wages of a meatpacking plant worker in Topeka, Kansas, had purchased a rifle that would help defeat an empire. This was not magic. This was simply what happened when freedom built systems that rewarded competence and trusted individuals to use what they built. The Japanese had spirit. The Americans had catalogs. On Guadalcanal, in the green hell of the Solomon Islands, the contest was decided not by which side fought harder, but by which side brought more to the fight. And America, with its mail-order rifles and its citizen soldiers, and its bottomless capacity to produce and ship and supply, brought more than any empire could match.